or good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carrie Browder, and I am the Director of Impact Accountability at Prime Coalition and the Director of Project Frame. We want to thank you all for joining us. I see some new faces as well as old friends. Once again, welcome. We're excited to have you here today. We'll be joined by two wonderful presenters, Leslie Capon from Astanor Ventures and Alyssa Ucko from Environmental Defense Fund. But first, I'm going to take some time to walk you all through what we have been up to over these past few months. And I first wanted to say many thanks to both my Prime and Project Frame family. I have been out on parental leave the past 3 months, and it has been amazing to see what everyone has been able to accomplish in my absence. So thank you all so much for your support there. If you're new and you want to learn about Project Frame, we are a nonprofit program convened by Prime Coalition, and our hope is to demystify climate investing. So it's not just for those who consider themselves climate investors, just investors in general. And we want to improve impact measurement and management practices and galvanize a network around leadership, transparency, and collaboration, focusing most of our attentions towards forward-looking emissions impact assessment. Here are a list of our steering committee members who are all best-in-class investors or consultants in their own right. And since launching a little over 2 years ago, we assessed our membership in June, and we are pleased to have over 700 community members representing 257 investment firms and a lot of assets under management, mostly focused on venture capital and private equity, but we're excited to see that there are other types of asset managers and asset owners who have become interested in our work and sharing best practices as well. We have been working really hard on developing practical methodological guidance for our community. We released our first full body methodological guidance last April. Since then, we have been overwhelmed with the amount of interest. You can see the downloads and views here. We know that this is just a piece and not enough, so we have a new working group that is focused on improving upon this, that we have been bringing together since April of last year, and we hope in the coming months to share updates to the methodological guidance for our community. If you would like to learn more about the methodology and the authors and contributors to its current form, we're in the process of a Q&A session featuring our different contributors. You can find that on our website, also through our LinkedIn. Our most recent ones will be featuring Shambhor Gupta of Clean Energy Ventures and Richard Searle from Climate Investments. Our current pre-investment methodology group is discussing the topics listed here. In some cases, they are topics that we just find it interesting to discuss as a community, and then we take back to our own offices and in our own practices. Others will become part of the methodology when it is released, and we hope to be wrapping up this work plan in April. Another area that we have been tasked with contributing is to tools and resources for our community. So this past summer, we launched our GHG Impact Resource Dashboard, and it is a repository that includes all of these different tools and service providers one can access for looking at forward-looking emissions impact. It is an evolving product, so if you have feedback or if you would like to be listed on the dashboard, please contact us. We'll have an email here in the slides a bit later. But so far, we're excited to see how it's been growing exponentially month over month. So many thanks to the team and the contributors from the Data and Tools Working Group that made it a reality. Also, our annual survey opens today. We had several contributors to the survey last year, which we did in partnership with World Fund. It was our inaugural, so this will be the second. We look forward to seeing how the feedback from everyone has shifted over this past year. We have an example of one of the questions. It only takes approximately 8 minutes, so we really hope that everyone will take the time to fill it out. It just provides us a better understanding of who our community is, what they're getting out of our contributions, and what they hope to see in the years to come. And for me, it's really exciting to see how our diversity is growing as far as the nations that are participating in Project Frame. So please fill out the annual survey. Next, we have our investor profiles, which is what I think attracts a lot of people to our community meetings. So far, we have completed 12, which are on our website, but we have heard from our community that sometimes it is a bit much to complete an entire profile. So we are experimenting with what we call snapshots. That is a much pared down version where you give highlights about your firm. And then we do hope to release a library of both investor snapshots and investors' impact reports within the year. So this is another opportunity if you're interested in showcasing your expertise, sharing your impact reports or a little bit about your firm. We are going to provide another avenue to do so as a hook to hopefully work with us to complete a more robust investor profile like the one that you'll be hearing about today. Another item that will be coming next year is an update of our field mapping exercise that we originally completed in 2022. This is your first opportunity to put something in the chat. We have a graphic up here that's just high level, the different players that we were looking at in the initial survey. And we would love to hear from you if there are any other actors in this field of emissions impact that you think we should be paying attention to. And we will go through the process of culling this information, putting it together, and releasing it to you in 2024. So please feel free to join in the chat if there are any actors that you think should be on our radar. I'll leave this up here for a little bit longer so people can take a look. Okay. All right, so actions for our community. This is the first time we're sort of doing it in this form, but hopefully it makes it easier for you all. Please complete the annual survey. It will be open until early January, but why wait? It only takes a few minutes to fill out, and we will be acknowledging all of the investors that contribute in the survey. You can contact us if you would like to sign up for an investor profile or test snapshot. And also, please suggest topics and speakers for our programming for next year. We want to continue to host this meeting open to the public bi-monthly in 2024. And we are pleased to say that there is more interest than our ability to provide. So now we have to be a little bit more critical. But it's a good problem to have, and we're really eager to hear from you all about what topics you think are most critical to discuss as a community outside of our investor profiles. Please feel free to submit any tools or service providers for our GHG Impact Resource Dashboard, and add any organizations that you think would be relevant to our field study to the chat. And then if you haven't already, we welcome you to join us as an observing member so you can continue to be part of the conversation, access our content, and find ways to engage with other investors who are interested in investing for our climate. All right. And with that, I would love to turn it over to our speakers. We have two speakers joining us here today. Our first is Leslie Cappan, who is the Director of Impact and Sustainability at Astanor, and Alyssa Ucko, who is the Senior Climate Scientist at the Environmental Defense Fund. Both are here to talk to us today about the relationship between greenhouse gases and our food systems. First, I'm glad to welcome Leslie, who is going to share the investor profile for Astanor, which recently announced their B certification and the closing of the second venture fund focused on many dimensions of impact that relate to food systems beyond just GHG emissions. Leslie and I met last year at the Gin, and we talked about this, so it's really exciting to see our aspirations of doing an investor profile together come to fruition. We appreciate that she's also joining us from COP. So it's been a very busy few days, I'm sure, for you, Leslie, on very critical work. So I'm going to turn it over to you to share your screen. Thank you for joining us.
And first, a huge thank you to, Kelsey, Anjali, and you, Carrie, for organizing the event tonight, and more importantly, for the investor profile. As you said, like we discussed that more than a year ago, and we worked on it with Anjali and Kelsey for quite a while. Indeed, it's a little bit time consuming. At the same time, I think it forced us to ask ourselves some questions as well. So I would definitely say that it was a huge benefit of doing it. So really strongly recommend people to go through the exercise, as I think it's a good one to do and a good way to share the way that we look at impact, all of us. So let me start with a bit of who we are. So what are we? Are an impact VC fund focused on the agri-food sector. So we were launched as an agri-food specialist 6 years ago. Our sweet spot is Series A, I will say, but we have a seed pocket and we can go to Series B as well. As you can see, we're pretty blessed because we have a team of 3 people in impact, which is enormous, I will say, for a VC fund. What's more important is that I was among the first person to be part of the team. So I joined the team almost 5 years ago when they were like the 2 founders and 2 other people, so a really small team. And the fact that the founders at this time decided to dedicate a full FT on impact shows the commitment that we had as an impact investor. The mission I was given at the time is, what does it mean to be an impact investor? How are we going to demonstrate to our investors that we've done a good job? How are we going to support our portfolio companies through their journey? So that was kind of a blank sheet of paper. And as you can imagine, it's been a thrilling journey for the last 5 years. There were no standard at the time 5 years ago. And as we know, there's still not yet a standard on how to measure impact, how to communicate impact. And there's still a lot of work, but we can see the huge improvement, I will say, over the last 5 years. And for us, it's been an amazing journey to build the way that how we look at impact over the last 5 years. In a nutshell, you mentioned some of the key facts, Carrie, already. We indeed closed our second fund a few months ago, our second VC fund, which makes us like AUM at 800 million today, which is a large fund in the agri-food sector, listed investors. As you mentioned also, I'm really pleased to share that we B Corp certified. For us, it means a tons. Why is it important to us? Is because we've been supporting our portfolio companies to be B Corp for years. And for us to be able to show that we lead by example, we walk the talk is extremely important. So really pleased to share that we become B Corp a few months ago as well, and something that is guiding us as an impact investor. We are a global investor. We invest mostly in the US and the Europe. I will say it's 50-50. We are invested in 44 companies. And among one of them is a bit of an outlier. In case you've seen it, is B2 Food in Australia, but Sweet Focus is Europe and the US. To tell you a bit more about what we do, indeed, we're an agri-food fund. What we tend to say is that we invest from soil and seed to gut. It's in a way like one step further than farm to fork. So we're going to look at solutions that are going to accelerate the transition towards regen ag. Any solutions such as bio fertilizer, bio control, but also like electrical autonomous tractors. But also extremely important, how can you finance the transition? How can you support those farmers to go through this transition that we need? Then we go through the entire journey of the agri-food sector, from connecting farmers and consumers, connecting farmers and buyers, sustainable packaging, alternative to plant-based, not plant-based, but plant-based alternative to meat and cheese and others. So we really invest through the entire value chain, which gave us this really holistic view of, how we want to tackle this entire sector. What we realized when we started when I started 5 years ago, is that, when you think about impact, we're not a climate fund ourselves. We are an impact fund focused on the agri-food sector. So it's not only about climate, it's a lot about nature, clearly. And it's a lot about people as well. It's a sector that's extremely complex, extremely interdependent. And so when we thought about how we're going to measure impact, we had to think extremely holistically. And that's why we came up with these 6 KPIs. We came up with this vision that in order to assess the impact that we had, and in a way, when I joined Astanor, there were five investments and 40 million more or less raised. And I used those 5 companies to say, okay, how I'm going to measure impact with those 5 companies. And this is the framework we put together 5 years ago, and it's still been the same. So completely aligned to what we measure. So we have 3 planet KPI. Why those 3 planet KPI? The agri-food sector is responsible for 1/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions. Sometimes you hear a quarter. If you think about the entire agri-food sector, from the packaging, so the use of transportation and everything, it's actually 1/3. It's one of the largest. It's at the same time a sector that's extremely dependent on biodiversity, because without biodiversity, more or less, there is no agri-food system. At the same time, is one of the biggest driver of biodiversity loss. On water, it's also the sector that is the biggest consumer of water, with 70% of fresh water being used by the agri-food sector. And sadly, 60% of this water is wasted. So when we think about agri-food, how to measure the impact on the planet, we use the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, the avoidance of water use, as well as the positive impact that we create on biodiversity. These are our 3 planet KPI. But as mentioned just before, it's not only about the planet, it's also about the people. And that's why we have 2 planet people KPI, which are social and health. When you think about social, it's a lot about providing higher remuneration for the farmers, providing financings to the farmers, but also providing accessibility of nutritious food to everyone. Health is about what can we bring as healthy product to our consumers, but also thinking about the farmers. How can you decrease the use of chemical inputs on the field or any other things that could harm the health of the farmers? So we really have these 5 KPIs which are made for the contributors. The thing is that not all our portfolio companies are direct contributors to the system. We have some of them that are simply enabling the system. They don't have a direct impact in terms of reduction in carbon emissions or providing remunerations to farmers, but they bring insight to the others. And that's why we have these 6 KPIs around, which is called impact intelligence. It's really about those companies that are bringing impact insight to the others to be able to make better decisions and themselves will decrease their environmental footprint. There's just one little thing I'm going to mention here, and I often just mention that, and I'm sure it's super clear to everyone in the room, but I think it's important, the difference between impact and ESG, because I still think sometimes they use intentionally, sorry for the awfully way of saying it, but you understand what I mean, in the fact that we really treat them separately. The ESG is about the internal health of a company. It's about the processes that the company is going to be able to put in place to allow this company to be a long-standing company. So it's about the culture that we allow a company to attract and retain talent. Impact is about the impact that the product or the service of this company is going to have externally and on the people and the planet. Why is it important for us to think about ESG? Sometimes people say it's old-fashioned. ESG is not a term that we want to use anymore. Why is it important? Is because we could invest in the most impactful product in the world with the biggest impact to unit economics. If you don't put the right practices in place in-house, this company will not be a long-standing company. So yes, for us, it's extremely important for our companies to become B Corp. We don't force, never. That's not the way we work. We collaborate with the partners, but we share with all portfolio companies why it's important and the benefit of being a B Corp. If they don't want to, that's not a problem anyway. We have ESG roadmap, ESG guidance we do internally, and that's something that's extremely important to us. So just a little reminder between the two, because the two are extremely important if we want to get to systemic impact. So how we do things pre-investment. The framework that we've put in place is really the way that the lens with which we looked at impact. As I often say, the impact team is not, you don't have the investment team on the side and the impact team on the other side. The impact team is here to empower and guide internally the investment team and the others on the impact. So what we bring: framework, processes, guidance to support our investment team to do the best decision from day one. So the investment team is the impact team. Everyone is impact. And so all the way that we thought about the 6 KPI that I just mentioned, and just by the way, one thing is that what's extremely important is when we look at those 6 KPIs, all companies should contribute to at least one of these KPI and should not harm any of the others. So a bit of a U taxonomy in a way, in the way that we think about impact, because you need to think about the negative externalities of your deal. We are not a greenhouse gas emissions focused fund. We're not a climate fund. we have to think holistically on all the impact that we have. So the framework that we've put in place allow the investment team to screen for ideas with the right framework. During the due diligence process, we spend a lot of time assessing what is going to be the contribution or the enabling in a way of a portfolio of this deal to our 6 KPI. What we've learned as well, and in fact, our investment agreements, the impact clause is fully available online. We've developed over the years like an impact clause, which is a bit heavy, I will say, but we really make sure that we align with our portfolio companies on the long term. And I think for us, it's really important to ensure alignment on the long term. Alignment, intentionality is extremely important, something we assess really carefully during the DD, but having that within our shareholder agreement is a great way to ensure it remains the same for the long term. So in a nutshell, and you've seen these kind of graphs in the past, what we look for is to identify what is the impact unit economics of my product. When we think about impact unit economics, is about all 6 KPIs. So it's not only about greenhouse gas emissions, which makes our life a bit more complex, I will say, but this is needed because we need to make sure we assess the impact that we have on a holistic basis. The one requirement we have as well, and that's part of the shareholder agreement, is that if we have one company that has a product or service that has an impact on the planet, we require what we call a life cycle assessment. Without a life cycle assessment, and hopefully everyone is aware of what it is, a life cycle assessment is an environmental footprint of a product on different criteria, including greenhouse gas emissions for sure, water use, and impact on biodiversity. So without an LCA, we're more or less blind. So it's a requirement for any of our companies to do an LCA. We don't do the LCA in-house. That's something we thought a lot about in the last few years. What we do instead, we empower all portfolio companies to do LCAs themselves. Because for us, the point is not to do a static LCA, is to have a dynamic LCA that people within our portfolio companies now know how to run. So what we bring to our portfolio companies, we bring experts and consultants on LCA and deals that we've negotiated for them to make sure that they can get robust LCA that will feed into your system. And this LCA for the planet, not for social and health, these different indicators, will feed our impact unit economics. If you think about social or impact unit economics, will be, for instance, one of our company called La Ruche Kidiwi, which increase the remuneration of farmers by 40 or 50% by cutting the supply chain. So really going from farmers to consumers. So the way that we will assess the impact unit economics is the increase of remunerations that our farmers are getting through the system. I think what's important is that, and I think, there was this question of value add versus additionality. This is our value add. Our value add as an investor is that we are the sustainability partner of our portfolio companies. Over the year, we've built like a shelf of solutions for them. They should really, anytime they have a question on sustainability, they know that they can come to us because we should have the answers. And if we don't, that's just something we need to build on. But over the years, we really build this shelf of solutions for them to do a carbon footprint, scope 1, 2, and 3. We are partnering with SWIP in this exercise, same with ESG, same with B Corp, with anything that they need, they know that we should have the answer. They have access to a full Notion page where they can get all the resources that we've built over the last 5 years, making us really the long-term sustainability partner of our portfolio companies. The one thing that really was a haha moment in a way is that 2 years ago, when I was explaining to our investors, the impact that we have, or 6 impact KPIs, what do they bring, that we avoided X amount of carbon emissions, that we reached X amount of farmers, or that we avoided that much water use, I realized that it was really hard for investors to grasp what we meant. Sometimes you can convert these greenhouse gas emissions in cars removed from the world, or you can think about Olympic pools or football pitch, but at the same time, it's still extremely anecdotal. So at this point, we realized that in order to scale impact investing, we needed to find a better way to measure impact. We needed a better way to communicate impact and to be able to provide to our investors something they will understand. And that's why 2 years ago, we launched a project of what we call impact valuation. What we do with it, we actually convert all the net positive impact of our portfolio companies into a monetary value. So what we want to say is to say, okay, with any net positive greenhouse gas emissions avoided, there's a price you can put next to it. There's different type of impact valuation factors that you can apply, we can monetize your impact, knowing that the point is to say, okay, for them, they will better understand, all portfolio companies will better understand the impact that they have. And for us, it's a way for them to support our pre-investment decision, because often we had the issue where we're thinking, okay, should we go to company A or B? This one is really about biodiversity. This one is really about greenhouse gas emissions. How can we make decisions? So that's where we started to think about how can we price that. So what we do is really we build what we call impact pathways for all our portfolio companies. And we look at 3 different types of capital: natural capital, human capital, and social capital. They are kind of really linked to our 6 KPIs. And all the work that we do with our portfolio company feed into these impact pathways, where we identified any net positive impact that we have for portfolio companies, which we, at the end, and it's really at the end, convert that into a monetary value. This is extremely helpful for us in terms of assessing pre-investment. It's extremely helpful for our portfolio companies themselves, because it allows them also to communicate with their other investors, but also to their customers, and what is the environmental and human and social benefit that they bring with their product or the solution. So what we aim to do really at the end, it's be able to communicate to our investors 2 metrics. First, this is my multiple at exit. I gave you a 4x out of my 250 million fund. I gave you 1 billion. I've done a good job. I gave you like a good multiple. But what did I give you on impact side? I gave you like a 2 billion. I gave you an 8x. So being able to demonstrate to your investors with a value, a monetary value, how successful we have been into our impact journey. This is extremely important also because 30% of our carried interest is linked to impact creation. And for us, the way to measure this impact success is with this multiple. For every euro that I invested in this company, how much euro of impact I have created. As you can imagine, the goal is to have as much multiple, the highest multiple as possible. And so maximization is what we aim for. The little formula you see at the bottom might seem extremely complex and is what we call the IMO, the impact multiple on investments. And this is something that's not finalized, but something to give you an idea, because as a VC investor, one of the problems we have is that some of our companies will have 0 realized impact during the time of investment. I give you one example. One of our company is producing biocontrol and biostimulant. This company is still into the process of being regulated. The products are being regulated today. The day they will be regulated, there's a high probability that this company will be sold directly into some of the big players in the market. In this case, does that mean that we realized we have no impact with the investment we've made? Clearly not, because without us being an early stage investor, there will be no impact. There will be no company at the end of the journey. So something that we really discuss highly with our investors or advisory committee, because everything that I just mentioned here with the impact valuation has been approved, validated by our advisory committee, which is our largest investors in the fund. They are fully committed into what we do. And we're really lucky to have some of the really large European funds, sovereign fund, like the EIF, the European Investment Fund, but also the French, the German, and quite a few others as well. So having them around the table, having them to challenge what we do is extremely important. This is something that is still to be, a lot of things still need to be done, but that gives you an idea that, what we aim to grasp at exit is not only the realized impact, but to find a way to actually, with like a discounted impact post-exit, to make sure that we captured some of the value that we've created with our portfolio companies. On the case study, really quickly to give you an idea, this is Yumiami, a French company that replaced chicken. So it's a blend-based alternative. I think the big difference to what you've seen in the market is it's actually a chicken breast fillet. So it's actually, they have a specific process that makes it, pretty thick. It really looks like a chicken breast, and it does taste like a chicken breast. So they have this kind of process called the humization, which makes kind of this texturization that makes the chicken being chicken. As you can imagine, by replacing chicken, they have an impact on our 3 planet KPI: biodiversity, greenhouse gas emissions, and water use. What we put at the bottom, they are in this impact onboarding phase, during which is the first year, usually, during which we build like strong life cycle assessment, strong baseline to make sure we can assess what's the impact unit economics. To give you an idea, this is the impact unit economics of Yumiami. what you need to understand is that the baseline is extremely important. Yumi is a French company, so the baseline is French chicken. It comes from a platform called Diadem, a French platform. So it's really a chicken replacement in France. If they were to enter the US market or the Australian market or the Asian market, we'll have to look at a different baseline because you're not replacing the same chicken. You really need to think compared to greenhouse gas emission, which is global, so wherever you are, anyway, it's global, but biodiversity, nature is not global. The land use replacement, the water pollution is going to be different depending where you are. So you have to think locally. So if you look at the bottom left, it's what we call then the cost, the impact unit economics. The price, the environmental footprint of Yumi is 96 cents for 1 kilogram of plant-based chicken, and while animal chicken is 2.22. So what we look at is the delta between these two. And so what you can see, the IMOI on the right, the 1.71, shows that by 2028, based on the business plan, we will have realized 1.71 IMOI, meaning that for each euro invested, they've created 1.71 impact. So that really gives you a bit of an idea of how we do things, knowing that I think it's important to understand that this is not perfect, but it gives you a really good indication of the direction of companies. Some companies, we realized when we were doing the exercise that the impact wasn't as large as we were expected. And for some of the others, it's enormous. And then when it's enormous, you think, okay, let's check twice or even more than twice to make sure that the data is correct. So I think the point is not to have a perfect tool, but to get a tool that allows you to ask yourself the right questions and to improve along the way as well. So maybe just in terms of lessons, we strongly believe that impact valuation is the future of impact measurement. Again, not as the only truth, but one of them. One of the tools that will allow investors to understand how successful they have been by allocating money to impact investors. I think we need to give them more. For climate, again, you have only one dimension, so it's a bit easier, but there are many social funds, environmental fund, nature fund coming into the market because how nature is becoming a more important topic and anyway, the nexus between impact on climate, and nature. So having a way to better measure the environmental and social impact of our portfolio companies is extremely important to show how material it has been, and being able to really show to our investor that we've been successful. Again, a lot of assumptions, we're fully aware of that. And we are currently collaborating with other impact investors that have been working on impact valuation to share knowledge. We're not that many that have been doing that, but as you can imagine, the whole point of doing this exercise has never been to keep it for ourselves, because if that was the case, then it would be a waste of our time, because we want to be able to compare funds, to compare investors, to get an idea. Okay, I am more focused on return, fair enough, or I'm more focused on impact. Where is definitely it's never like, we all try to say it's equal, but it's never perfect, so at least getting an idea of how successful you have been on return on investment and return on impact. I think it will really allow to get impact investing to the next stage and really get investors to join the journey of investing towards impact investors, which I think it's not always easy to get them to do.
All right. Thank you so much, Leslie. It's really interesting to hear about all the work that you're doing and how complex the process is. Let's give Leslie a virtual round of applause, please. We do have a couple of Q&As, so why don't we start with one here that I have from Pierre is, how do you assess the quality of your LCAs since it is done by the company itself?
So indeed, it's done by the company with the support of our experts. So that's one thing. So the first one is usually done in collaboration with our experts. And then when you reach to the right level of scale, then you need to get it certified by an external provider. So it has to be done in collaboration with external parties. What I meant by internalization is that I really do think that, especially in early stage, the way it used to be done in the past, you used to hire a consultant, you pay often like large amount of money, between 20 to 50K for a PowerPoint at the end with data. As you know, our companies change, the raw ingredients, the processing, they go from pilot to scale. You need this data, and because the whole point when you do an LCA is to improve your process as well. So you will expect that your impact in economics is going to get better and better because you understand where your footprint is. So we do it in-house, but with experts externally. And at some point, it needs to be certified because, as you may know, when you want to share LCA data to the world, you need to get it certified, because if not, I mean, who will trust the data? And one thing as well, we know LCAs are not perfect. They're far from perfect. For instance, we have huge issues being an agri-food investors because soil health and marine biodiversity are really not well captured in an LCA, and something that we succeed to kind of overcome with the impact valuation. Because today, changing an LCA framework is not possible. So the impact valuation gives us a bit of these options. And again, with the impact valuation, the point is to be extremely transparent, so our investors see everything which is in it, and really it's an open book. So everyone should understand exactly what's behind an impact valuation, an IMOI, and an LCA.
Thank you. Before I go to the next question, a couple of call outs from your discussion that I think are very aligned with what we're doing in Frame was your emphasis on establishing your baseline local to where you are. I think baseline setting continues to be the crux of a lot of issues in the conversations that we're having at Project Frame, and remains to be a challenge, and sort of where you source the data for your baseline. So it's really interesting to see how you showed your baseline setting strategy for the company that you shared in the case study. Another question we have here is about your use of B Corps as a sort of a lever for influence with your companies. Does the pathway to being a B Corp affect your investment decision-making pre-investment in any way? And how many portfolio companies are you currently working with on the path to B Corp certification?
No, it's a great question. And as I said, it's a great thing to have, but we don't force anyone. We don't want to prevent companies to go on this journey. But what we do at time of investment, the one thing we do is to get our companies to change the articles of incorporation. Because when you want to become a B Corp, you need to change this one legal thing you need to do is to change your articles of incorporation to include the language. So this is something that usually, if the companies agree, and once they disagreed, but we still invested, is to change it at time of investment. Why? Because what we realized often is that few months post-investment, when we kind of convinced them to go through the journey, they had to recall the investors and spend time and money to change the articles of incorporation. So we do that at time of investment to save time and money for everyone. And so I think for us, like, we have companies that refuse to go through this path, or we refuse, but I think we're getting there. Especially in the US, I think it's a bit more tricky than in Europe. I think in Europe, interestingly, because B Corp is initially certification, not a European one. But I think it's a journey, you need to embark them. You know, we do impact community meeting once a quarter. Our last one was again on B Corp. And so it's a journey. And what we do now actually is that now that we B Corp, now that we embark a lot of our companies, a bit more than 12, I will say, so not much in a way as we have 40 deals, but still working on it, is that we embark our LPs. So the next meeting we're doing, in fact, next week with our LPs is to get all LPs to become B Corp. So to try to have a ripple effect with all our stakeholders.
I'm sure the LPs will empathize a bit more with the companies once they understand how challenging the process can be to reach certification. You brought up a really interesting point around double materiality. The Project Frame community, as of last year, those who filled out our annual survey, there were 80% said that they were seeking above market rate returns. Can you provide an example of how you worked with a company that in a classic venture scenario might have to pivot away from impact in order to be financially sustainable, and how you keep them on a path towards double materiality as you see it?
I think it's a really good point. I think it's a tricky one. I mean, luckily, we never had any of our companies that pivoted to this direction because the product itself in which we invest is impactful. You know, if you think about the electrical autonomous tractors, they're not going to change from electrical to diesel because the whole point of the tractor is to be electrical. The plant-based meat is always, I mean, all our companies are so, the theory of change is extremely clear that there is no way they should get out of the impact pathway that they have. That said, we're currently looking at a deal his DNA is not fully impact. And for the first time, and I'm pleased to hear if others have done that, what we're looking at is to include 30% of our carry that's linked to impact creation. We are looking to link their remuneration, long-term incentive towards impact creation. So replicating what we experience as an investors to our portfolio companies to make sure that they align on the journey. So that's the first we're doing it. And I think, honestly, I'm sure it's going to be a learning that we could even bring to our portfolio companies that are impactful, but just to remain even more incentivized to go to those markets that might be more important.
Thank you so much, Leslie. I think everyone can agree that incentives are really important in framing the conversation between the capital and the ventures themselves. Really interesting. Thank you so much for presenting. Next, I'm excited to welcome Alyssa Acco, based in DC near me. She is a senior climate specialist at the Environmental Defense Fund, and who will be talking with us about often misunderstood facts around global warming and GHGs by spotlighting an example in the food system. Personally, I hope this information will help us think more strategically as investors and consumers passionate about the longevity of a livable climate. And with that, I turn it over to you, Alyssa, if you'd like to share your screen. Thank you for joining us.
So thank you, everyone, for being here and for being interested in this topic, which is so important. Thank you so much, the organizers, for inviting me. I'm a senior climate scientist at EDF. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Environmental Defense Fund, we are a global environmental NGO that is all in on addressing the climate crisis using a combination of science, economics, law, and partnerships. And today I want to share some insights on identifying the most effective climate actions. And I will also discuss some of our recent work on evaluating the climate impact of food systems within the context of these insights on how to identify the most effective climate actions. So I'm going to try and make the case today that there are a set of well-known climate science facts that are really critical for motivating climate actions. But there's actually a lesser known set of facts that I think are key to identifying the most effective climate actions. So just to start with the well-known climate science facts, the first one is that, the planet is warming rapidly. I'm sure everyone is familiar with graphs like these that demonstrate the rapid warming that our planet has experienced since the Industrial Revolution, and it continues to climb. And this year is virtually certain to be the warmest year on record. And the second most well-known, one of the most well-known facts is that we have several lines of evidence that human actions are responsible for today's climate warming. These different lines of evidence have made it extremely clear, and this is what scientists think global temperatures would have looked like over this past century or so without human influence. And then the third well-known fact is that our actions determine our future. So before we acted on climate, we were on a really dangerous path. With current policies, we now have considerably brought down future warming levels, and drastic actions could bring this down much further. The world has agreed to try to limit warming well below 2C and ideally 1.5C, given the vast amount of research that shows the tremendous benefits from a 1.5C world versus a 2C world. And with each new commitment, we're getting closer. So for example, if we were to achieve all of the nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement, it would get us to maybe around 2.7 degrees Celsius. And full implementation of all the announced targets before some of the recent progress made at this year's COP showed that we could potentially get down to below 2C. So these are the well-known climate science facts, and they make it clear that there's this problem, we know the cause, and we generally know the solution. And so this can be very motivating in taking action. But again, there's these lesser known facts that I think are really key to identifying the most effective climate actions once we are motivated. So the first one that I want to stress is that while the planet is warming rapidly, the planet would actually be much warmer without air pollution. So when we look at the around 1 degree Celsius of warming that we're experiencing today relative to pre-industrial levels, that is the net warming impact, because human activities can both warm and cool the climate. So if we just look at our actions that warm the climate, we'd have nearly twice as much warming as we're experiencing today. Human-induced cooling is masking some of this additional warming, and around 80% of that cooling is coming from emissions of air pollutants. So this means as we clean up our air, especially because these cooling pollutants are very short-lived and the warming pollutants are much longer-lived. So if we clean up our air and we reduce greenhouse gas emissions at the same time, it will take a long time for the human-induced warming to disappear, but the human-induced cooling will be gone immediately. So this is a very complicated figure from the latest IPCC assessment report published a couple years ago now, but it is one of my favorite figures. And so it's worth looking into if you're not familiar with it. And this kind of shows you where the human-induced cooling pollutants are coming from, both sectorally on the left, but also regionally on the right. And so the major sources of human-induced cooling are fossil fuel combustion for energy, industry, and land transportation, and in Eastern and Southern Asia. These are also the sectors and the regions that are major sources of warming pollutants. But what this figure also shows is the impact of current emissions on future temperatures, both over the following 10 years and 100 years. So each one of these different categories has 2 bars associated with it. And so the top one is the 10 years and the bottom one is the 100 years. And so this is what clearly shows how these cooling pollutants mostly impact the climate in the near term relative to the warming pollutants that last for much longer. So what's at stake here if we don't take this into account is that we could have a temporary but rapid rise in temperature, especially locally, when we reduce air pollution. And the solution here is that the earlier we reduce air pollution, the lower the absolute peak of this warming bump will be. So imagine in the future, if temperatures climb to a higher level than they are at right now, and then we unmask this additional warming, that temperature bump will be on top of already the background amount of warming that we're experiencing. So we want to clean up our air as soon as we possibly can. So when we unmask this warming, we're still at a lower level than we potentially would be in the future. So the second lesser known fact is that while human actions are responsible, carbon dioxide emissions are actually only responsible for around half of today's warming. And a lot of people think that CO2 is, the main cause, and it generally is, but people don't realize how much the other climate pollutants play a role in contributing to climate change today. So we focus primarily on carbon dioxide because of how much we emit and how long it lasts in the atmosphere. And because we started addressing climate change in the 1990s, when climate change was a future concern that we wanted to prevent. But now the climate change is pervasive and felt daily across the world. There's a whole set of other climate pollutants that we need to consider to fully address the problem. So what's at stake here is not addressing the full extent of the climate change problem. And the solutions are having these individual targets and actions for each climate pollutant and not just focusing, for example, on one of them like carbon dioxide. Methane is one of the climate pollutants that I do a lot of research on, for example, and that accounts for more than a quarter of today's warming, which was in the pie chart that I just showed. So then the third lesser known fact is that while our actions determine the future, there are different actions for slowing down and limiting the maximum extent of warming. So we care about climate change over all timescales. The rate of warming is really important because that determines the pace of shifting weather patterns and extremes and how intense and extreme those extremes become. It determines the timing of really uncertain but catastrophic tipping points, spreading vector diseases, society and ecosystems' ability to adapt and keep up to a changing climate. But then the maximum extent of warming is also essential to limit because this will determine the overall extent of ice loss and sea level rise, and it will determine shifts in coastlines and biomes and crop zones. It can disrupt ocean circulation and lead to permafrost melting that will unleash even more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So we really need to address both the rate of warming and the maximum extent of warming. And each of these are actually controlled by different sets of climate pollutants. The rate of warming is controlled by short-lived climate pollutants that are really powerful but don't last long in the atmosphere. And then the maximum extent of warming is controlled by the long-lived climate pollutants that build up over time. And so every day that we emit more, they're just committing us to warming for generations to come. And so the prominent short-lived climate pollutants are methane, but also carbon monoxide, volatile organic compounds, HFCs, black carbon, and NOx. So these are all pollutants that some of these are air quality pollutants too. Some of these don't trap heat themselves, but contribute to changes in atmospheric chemistry that end up warming the climate. And these pollutants are short-lived. So this figure on the right is just illustrative in terms of if we emit the same amount every year, they aren't building up over time, which is why when you reduce their emissions, we have a near immediate impact on reducing climate change. On the other hand, the long-lived climate pollutants do build up over time. They're mainly carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and CFCs, which we've now phased out the CFCs, but some of them are still in the atmosphere contributing to climate change today. And this is why we really need net zero. And this is where the net zero concept came from, because even if we emit the same amount of emissions every year, they don't break down as fast as we're inputting them into the atmosphere. So they linger and they stay and they commit us to warming for a long time. And so I'm no expert on the time value of carbon concept that Carrie mentioned earlier, but I do believe that many of you are familiar with it. And it's that greenhouse gas emissions cut today are worth more than cuts promised in the future. And my perspective is that this concept especially relates to the long-lived climate pollutant reduction, because we're preventing buildup over time the earlier we act. So just again, to look at this pie chart of what contributes today to climate change, to warming. Again, these are not the coolers, these are just the warmers. You can see that around half of today's warming is coming from these short-lived climate pollutants, and around half is coming from the long-lived climate pollutants. The sooner we act on both, the more warming we can reduce immediately, and the more warming we can prevent in the future. So what's at stake here if we aren't mindful of these distinctions is that we end up with suboptimal climate actions and missed opportunities to slow down warming. And the solutions here are to really have distinct strategies for each set of pollutants. So for the short-lived climate pollutants, we want to cut as much as we can. We want to cut as fast as we can. And we don't need to reach net zero emissions for these short-lived climate pollutants because they don't build up over time. For the long-lived climate pollutants, we do need the net zero emissions because they'll just keep increasing otherwise. But the earlier we act, the better, because we are preventing a lot of pollution from getting into the atmosphere that sticks around for a long time. And protecting carbon stocks is also really important. I don't have time to go into it now, but if you think about how much carbon can be stored in a forest, for example, and then that forest is cut down, if we try to rebuild that forest, then it could take about a century for that forest to get to a point where it is then holding the same amount of carbon that it once was. So it's thinking through things like this, that it's much more valuable to preserve these carbon stocks that we have now than to think about reforestation, for example. So that's just something that's also another strategy for the long-lived climate pollutants. I do want to address a really important issue that I've been working on for more than 10 years now, which is that short-lived climate pollutants and long-lived climate pollutant emissions are often combined into targets, into LCA, into impact assessment tools. And because of the historical focus on carbon dioxide, the metric that's used to combine all of the emissions ends up masking the near-term warming of the short-lived climate pollutants like methane. And this is because we are evaluating all of the climate pollutants based on their long-term impact compared to CO2. And so a short-lived climate pollutant like methane that only lasts in the atmosphere for a decade or so, in that mathematical expression, you are accounting for decades of time where the methane is no longer influencing the climate. And so you are masking its true impact in the near term. This can be very problematic and lead to conclusions that aren't necessarily consistent with what the science would tell you is the impact from different actions. So an example of this, we published a study earlier this year where we looked at the breakdown of how different sectors appear when we're looking at, in this bar chart, emissions going forward from a no action case from today through mid-century, and what the warming impact of these sectors are in 2050. And this is what you get when you use these simplified metrics. But then when you use a climate model that's more sophisticated and more accurate, we get a completely different result. In fact, you end up seeing these methane dominated sectors that the majority of the greenhouse gas emissions coming from them are methane, end up to be twice as high as what this simple metric would tell you. And so this is really important for addressing climate actions, for example, in sectors like agriculture. I know these percentages are a little different than what Leslie shared. And in some of this, there's, for example, transport and industry and land use. Some of those would go into a full accounting of the food system's impact, for example. And so that's why these numbers might seem a little different. Also, they're a future projection. And so it's just the math is a little different here, but the idea is it relates to however, whatever time period you are looking at for emissions and however you decide to break down your specific sectors and categories, which is that when you use these simplified metrics, they're not generally consistent with what's actually happening to the climate. And so now I'll share one of my teams, another recent study by my team that looked at the global food system and how it contributes to climate change. And in this study, the agriculture component includes the transport and land use and all of those impacts as well. The motivation here was that the majority of studies that look at how food systems impact the climate are based on the simplified metric that undervalues methane's role. So we published this work in Nature Climate Change earlier this year, which basically tried to do a more accurate accounting for what the future warming could look like from food consumption. So the first thing we had to do was develop our own inventory for current global food consumption emissions for individual greenhouse gases, because when you look at the existing inventories, they lump all the greenhouse gas emissions together using these simple metrics. So we started with previously published combined life cycle greenhouse gas emissions for 94 different food items. But then we took 100 different research studies and used those to break apart those combined life cycle greenhouse gas emissions into their individual greenhouse gas emissions. And then we looked at food consumption patterns for 171 different countries for these 94 food items. We looked at 5 different population scenarios, and we projected what could happen in the future based on the individual greenhouse gas emissions. So we used a simple climate model to project future warming impact, and we also looked specifically at the attribution of the future warming impact to individual gases and food groups. And then finally, we assessed the climate impact from different mitigation strategies. This was largely to be illustrative and to give us a sense of things and can be used for more specific actions in the future. But these are generally the categories that we looked at, and we tried to look at as realistic as possible options that are somewhat viable. For example, not just everyone, not eating meat anymore, but looking at more of a healthy diet and making sure that countries that don't get enough protein do get enough protein, things like that. So our first key finding from our analysis is that global food consumption alone could add almost a degree Celsius of warming by end of century, and about 60% of this is coming from methane. If we look at the different food groups that are contributing to this warming, more than half of the warming is driven by the consumption of animal products, shown here in green. And then the third finding is that more than half of the warming can be avoided from viable options to reduce emissions. So here we have the no action case, which is in red, that you saw in the first key finding. And then we have 2 different scenarios for food loss that are consistent with global goals, and then decarbonization of food production, which has a lot to do with the energy that's used in the food industry, and then the global conversion to a healthy diet, and the production improvements, mainly to livestock, for example. And then the purple is combining all of these together. But the bottom line here is that these are insights that cannot be gained when you combine greenhouse gases into a single value. So the solutions here, I totally understand that using a climate model to evaluate actions is often impractical. So I'm not suggesting doing that, but best practice is keeping different greenhouse gas emissions separate, not combining things and presenting all the information in a combined metric, but having, for example, when you report your emissions for your company, showing the emissions of carbon dioxide and of methane separately, for example. And if a metric is needed, and there are certainly many situations when it is, a best practice that we suggest is using a two-valued global warming potential with both a 20 and 100-year time horizon. And we have another study that we published several years ago on this topic that I will also drop in the chat, that conveys the impacts in both the near and long term in a way that's fairly adequate and aligns with the more sophisticated scientific modeling. Instead of just relying on these long-term metrics, you also partnered them with the short-term metrics as well. In summary, we have these well-known facts, these lesser-known facts that relate to them. If we don't account for these lesser-known facts, we could end up with suboptimal outcomes, but there are solutions for all of these. So I won't walk through all of these, but here's just a summary of everything that I said. So thank you so much for your attention, and love to answer any questions you all have. Thank you so much.
That was fascinating. I do think I'll try to support some of our investors in the frame community, and that global warming potential was a topic for our report last year for the methodology, but it does seem to be nascent and we need to see more of it. And I think that your research could be really helpful in directing our capital to the most influential products. First, round of applause, please, for Alyssa. Thank you so much for presenting. Really interesting. But first, Alyssa, one Q&A from the chat and one that was sent to me directly. In addition to disaggregating GHGs, do you think investors should work cooling versus warming into their methodologies? Or do you think investors should be translating GHG impact into warming and cooling impact?
Yeah, I think any relevant climate pollutant needs to be incorporated in order to get the most accurate assessment of the climate impacts of decisions. One reason why I think as a first step, I would push for including all the relevant warming climate pollutants, acknowledging that while warming and cooling is, they're both important, but it's the warming pollutants that last longer. Even the short-lived warming pollutants can last for a year to a decade, whereas all of the cooling pollutants last for about a week. So while they are important to incorporate, and I would say as a scientist, incorporate everything you possibly can, and there are GWP values associated with every one of these climate pollutants that are available, the cooling pollutants, there's sometimes too much of an emphasis, for example, on, let's say, sulfur dioxide emissions from coal plants, and how they add so much cooling that it offsets some of the CO2, which can lead to it making it look like the coal plants aren't as bad as you think they are. So again, include all the climate pollutants you can, but be mindful of this time, this temporal evolution and how it changes things, so it doesn't make it look like, some action won't be as beneficial to the climate as it will be when you look at it over multiple timeframes.
Thank you. One of your graphics did sort of break down the different industries and how they affected different areas. Waste is a passion project for many of us who are trying to tackle climate change. Are there any food-specific areas that you think that we could be the most impactful? I mean, I did see meats in there, which I think drives a lot of interest and investment among this group. But are there any areas that you're like, oh, I don't think people realize how important that could be, that we should be paying more attention to?
It's a really good question. I'm not sure I have the best answer for it, other than the fact that when we rely on the GWP 100, it doesn't look like it's as valuable to reduce food loss, for example, or to compost, for example, or to pursue or invest in these methane inhibitors for livestock, for example. So those things make a really big difference and are really important. And that's another reason why, as the investor community should use the two-valued GWP approach, because then it will really show how much potential there is to actions like those that otherwise won't look as impactful as they really are.
Thank you. I'm just wondering if there is a way to try to incorporate this into our methodology. Leslie, I can see you thinking.
it's
Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I fully agree with Elisa, and I think that's, you know, something we've been extremely careful over the last few years into not look at the greenhouse gas emissions as a group, especially because, as you pointed out, you know, agri-food sector is highly responsible for methane, and understanding how we can curb this, I think for us was key to dive into, you know, greenhouse gas emissions. At the same time, as you pointed, you know, like it's not easy when you do an LCA or others to get to this level of details. And I love the way that, you know, the 2000 kind of lens support is great. And I do think, as you said, that, you know, having this better understanding of greenhouse gas shows that, you know, the agri-food sector is actually one of the sector we really need to tackle really quickly, because that's one that, you know, has some of the most potent gas for sure.
Thank you. And then a question related to something that you said in the very beginning. While I'd like to believe in our community that facts are what drive change, anecdotally, I feel like that is not always the case. Does EDF have any projects coming up or campaigns that can help raise global awareness to this dynamic? And if not, what can we do to help?
I'm not sure how to answer that one and what I can and can't share publicly. But it is something that we've been working on for a long time to just promote awareness of these different distinctions. And something that I work a lot on right now that didn't come up at all in my presentation is hydrogen as a decarbonization strategy. And so a lot of these issues play a role with that as well, because hydrogen is a leak-prone molecule that is an indirect greenhouse gas that warms the climate when it escapes into the atmosphere. And its warming effects are not included in LCAs right now. And even if they would be, its impacts like methane are short-lived, so they would be undervalued with the GWP 100. So we do have plans in the works for campaigns globally and in specific regions where hydrogen is really prominent to really focus on how you need to incorporate the best available and latest science in these tools, because a lot of these tools are very outdated. They use Kyoto Protocol greenhouse gases, for example, that were decided in the 1990s. And we know these indirect greenhouse gases, which were not included in the Kyoto Protocol, make up around 20% of the warming we're experiencing today. Another thing is just methane emissions. We've spent the past 10 years really ramping up our knowledge of how much methane comes from the oil and gas industry. And those emissions are also not included in some of these assessment tools. So we do have a lot of plans in the works for just including the latest science in all of these decision-making frameworks.
Thank you. That is encouraging. Hopefully that'll help me sleep a little bit better tonight. All right. Well, once again, a round of applause to our speakers. Thank you so much. Really fascinating discussion. And I know that there are several things from both that I hope to take and incorporate into some of our outputs for Project Frame next year. So we'll work on hopefully saving the planet together more soon. For those who want to hang out so they have a safe space to finish their annual survey, I will hang out with you. Otherwise, we want to say farewell and we wish everyone a safe and happy holiday season. Thank you. And we will see you again in 2024.